Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk a little bit about rule sets, including magic systems, and how they relate to stories. Not just stories that are in a fantasy setting or a science fiction setting, but stories in any genre. I'll show you what I mean and I'll take you there. But a little bit of background to this video. A couple years ago, I made a different video called Fantasy Does Not Excuse Impossibility. That's been pretty popular. And if you didn't watch that video, the gist of it is that basically, just because you're in a fantasy setting doesn't mean you can do anything. This is a common, thing that people would say when I said this isn't really possible or you can't really do that, say in Star Wars. It's like, it's a fantasy setting. Anything is possible. Like you could turn into a rabbit and shoot lasers out of your eyes and Darth Vader could blow up. It's like, no, that's not how it works if you actually want to tell a good story. The truth is you need to create a system that kind of hems in your magic, creates a defined path for how your magic can actually exist and be used. This is very important for storytelling because we want our characters to feel like they're in real danger. Like at any given moment, they can't just pull something out of their back pocket to overcome a plot obstacle, like, turn into a rabbit and start shooting lasers out of their eyes. Really important to have that story tension going, to believe that the reader has an idea of what is actually possible. It's also important for the overall effect of the story when a reader or a viewer is trying to forecast the solution of the plot. They're trying to figure out how things are actually going to resolve, and they're going to be making their predictions in the framework of what you've established as the limits for your magic system. Same thing actually applies outside of the fantasy genre and to things greater than magic. You're always creating limits that hem in the possibilities of your story for both of those reasons, to determine what's possible and also so that the reader or the viewer can be making a prediction about how plot is going to resolve so you can surprise them. Because what you're going to do is you're going to show them ways for plot to resolve outside of their expectations. And here comes the real point of this video, which is that you actually can violate the rules of a magic system, but it comes down to execution and it comes down to timing. And I'll talk about how this is accomplished very, very frequently, especially in the 3-act structure, which you see in movies. Happens all the times in books, but you'll see it a lot in the 3-act movie structure. So a little bit of technical stuff. Most of the time, you're going to be defining your rule set for your story in what's called the exposition. The exposition is the first part of your story, usually the first 25 to 30% of your story, but it could be shorter if you're very efficient. It could be longer if there's a lot more to talk about. And in that setting, in that part of the exposition, you're going to talk about setting, characters, and plot. You're going to introduce the setting. The setting's the place and time that your particular story is taking place in. So if it's taking place on a ship at sea, for example, you know that there's some rules associated with that. You can't just jump off the ship because you'll drown. Same thing with a spaceship. You can't just leave the spaceship, right? You're out in space. It creates a limit for what the characters can do. Same thing if you're in 1920s Chicago. You can't flip on a TV and watch the news, right? So wherever you place your story, that creates limits on what the story can actually do and what characters can do. Next are the characters themselves. They have limits. They are a certain size, they're a certain intelligence, they're a certain sex, and depending on your setting, they may be relevance for race. If they're a black character in 1920s Alabama, that's going to create a different set of limits than if they're a black character in 1990s Los Angeles, right? So it's important to know how characters are actually going to interact with the setting, but the characters themselves have limits. And you're going to show in the exposition what the characters are actually capable of doing. That way, later on in the plot, the reader is forecasting the possibilities for what can actually happen and is not going to be, is always going to feel like there's some tension in each scene because the characters are going to be coming up against obstacles which actually challenge them. And the last thing that you're going to be talking about is the plot in the exposition. You're going to be showing the main conflict and therefore what I call the main plot goal. The way that you want things to turn out in the end is going to be established in your exposition, and that's going to be filtered through those limits that you create to create an overall prediction by the reader or the viewer for what's going to happen. So in this exposition, it's very important that you actually show what your limits are. If you're trying to spread the rule set out beyond the exposition, you'll find that it probably doesn't come out as well as you want. Just as an example, let's look at the fantasy genre because that's what we're starting with. If you wanted to write a story about a wizard and the main character was going to be a wizard, if you have characters that aren't the main character as wizards, you don't have to do as much definition of magic. But if the main character is himself a wizard, you need a magic system. And you're going to show that magic system in the exposition. You're going to show the wizard doing some magic, doing something that lets the reader know, hey, this is a wizard. This is what he's capable of doing. And especially if you can show something that is against his limits. This is the hardest spell I know, if he can say something like that and then do a spell. Later on in the book, if you see him do the spell again, no big deal. It doesn't feel like it's out of place. It doesn't feel like you've pulled something out of your pocket, like here's a laser rabbit out of my pocket to solve the plot. It's going to feel okay. Likewise, if he does something that's relatively lower powered than what you see, if he does something a little simpler, like if you show at the beginning he can conjure fireballs and later in the story he lights a candle, then obviously we have an idea that those two things are congruent. They work together. And if you want to break that limit, you can't break it completely. You can maybe he gains a little bit of power, he learns a new spell, and therefore his power goes out a little bit. And he can use that new spell to overcome the final plot goal, overcome the final obstacles in the story to accomplish his own goals. Let's look at some practical examples. Again, we'll start with fantasy. I think a great example is actually the Wheel of Time series. You'll see exactly this being done in every single Wheel of Time book. There's 13 books in total, and there is kind of a little, formula that Robert Jordan used. Of course, the last 3 books were finished by Brandon Sanderson, himself a very, very competent author in utilizing magic systems. But what Robert Jordan would do is that he would introduce the characters, and he does this in the first book, and shows what's possible within the one power for that story. And then at the end of the story, the characters grow in power a little bit. They learn a forgotten technique, or they figure out something new that people didn't know about the one power, and it allows them to overcome a previously insurmountable goal. So it might be like Nynaeve figures out how to heal being severed from the one power. This is like a new thing. They don't know how to do it. Now, it's not that big of a leap to figure out that that's what you can do. It's not like she figured out how to blow up the earth or something. She figured out how to do something that was maybe a forgotten technique. There's a part where Rand figures out how to skip through like this nether realm of blackness, and then he figures out how to just teleport to new locations. So first he figures out how to skip, then he figures out how to teleport. He slowly powers up over the course of the entire series. And so the key in the execution there is that each time the characters power up, they power up a little bit. Power up just a little bit that helps them to overcome the goal. They grow in power a little bit. They discover how to sever somebody from the one power. They discover how to tie off a spell or something. It's always a small growth with each volume. But by the time you get to the 13th book, they're like godlike powers. They're really, really powerful characters. And you wouldn't be able to pull that off if you didn't have those incremental steps where you're just expanding. You're expanding a little at a time. This also occurs in Star Wars. If you look at the first 3 movies, the Force, we don't see a whole lot of what the Force does. But by the time we get to the 3rd movie, we see a character that does lightning, let's say. We haven't ever seen a character that's as big and bad as Darth Sidious. Lightning is not completely out of the realm of possibilities. So each movie adds kind of a new thing, like a teleportation is added kind of in the 2nd movie. And then we have some repetition of the tricks in the first movie to show how Luke has grown, and then we finally bust out a little bit of a stronger power at the end, Force lightning. Now, what you don't want to do is you don't want to do what the sequels have done with Star Wars. I'll use this as an example of probably what you shouldn't do. So, just as an example, in The Force Awakens, the first of the Disney Star Wars movies, there's a point where Rey, the main protagonist, uses a Jedi mind trick. And while we've seen the Jedi mind trick used in past Star Wars movies, she does it without ever having seen it and without ever having it be taught to her. And so while it seems like the Jedi mind trick is within the rule set, it's actually not, because there's another part of the rule set, which is you have to know how to do it. You have to learn how to do things with the Force. It takes training. That's why we have these training. That's why you have a Jedi school in the prequels. It's why we have Luke training with Yoda. So it actually feels like a big violation of the rules, like a too much of a power growth that's not justified. And it comes off as like a little Mary Sue moment for her in The Force Awakens because of that lack of the second half of the rule, which is that you have to be taught how to do this. You don't just have knowledge from nothing, at least not in the way that the Force used to work. And a lot of the parts of the sequels have these little sections where maybe they're using a force power that existed before, but not in a way that is consistent with how it was done in the past. Then you finally have, this is going to be a little bit of a spoiler for the newest movie, Rise of Skywalker. We have a moment towards the end where the power growth is so exponential and so unexpected, we don't quite know what to make of it. Where we've seen a lot of the force tricks used in the past. There's even a Chekhov's gun used in the last movie, which is where we see her using a new power, like a force heal, kind of new, and it's existed in the setting for years and years before she does it. And then she uses it again in later parts of the story, and other characters use it on her, whatever. The real one where it's like, what? Is where Darth Sidious is like shooting lightning into the sky and just like disabling an entire fleet of starships. The power growth from shooting lightning, like zapping Luke, to blowing up an entire fleet is such an exponential growth. It's completely unbelievable. We just, even though it's a fantasy movie, we just shut off and we're like, well, that's implausible. Because we've never seen anything close to that level of power, at least in the movies. The EU, the extended universe, that might be a different story. But in the main series of movies, this is a completely out of bounds thing. This isn't just a little, we're gonna go kind of around the rules to expand, and we're gonna expand the rules a little bit. It's like a blowing up of the rules. It's probably what you should avoid doing. Now let's go ahead and let's move outside the fantasy genres and talk about how this occurs really in every single genre. So for those of you who are writing outside of the fantasy genres, this should be pretty relevant. I'm going to give you an example to show what I mean. So I think courtroom drama movies are actually really good examples of how you can see this in work, because when you're walking into a courtroom, there's the rules. The rules are the law and the way that you can actually operate in the court, the rules of procedure. And so I think that's part of what makes courtroom drama so compelling, is there's a very stiff rule set for what you can do. It's very challenging to figure out how to break the rules or work outside the rules. And that's what makes a lot of courtroom drama type stories, whether it's a John Grisham book or it's like a Law and Order episode. It's what makes them compelling. So I'm going to give you two examples. One's a comedy and one's a drama. Let's start with a comedy. The comedy is Liar Liar, because this actually contains a magic system. So Liar Liar, starring Jim Carrey. It's a very funny movie from the 1990s, I think. And the premise is, magically, Jim Carrey's son makes a wish that his dad can't lie anymore. And so his dad cannot lie. Now, this is a problem because his dad is a lawyer. And so part of the main story here is that he's representing a client, and their legal strategy has been to lie. They're going to put her on the stand, and they're just going to lie about her having an affair with another man because she's going through a divorce. She's trying to, get out of a prenuptial agreement. So that's what they're going to do. They're going to lie. Problem is, he can't lie. So we've created a rule set and a rule system, and what the audience is wondering is, how is he going to represent his client without being able to lie? How is this lawyer going to do his business without being able to lie in this circumstance? And so lots of things, he goes through all these different things to try to solve the problem. He beats himself up in the bathroom, and the judge says, "Can you continue?" And he still can't lie, and he says, "Yes, Your Honor, I can continue." But here's where the rule system gets tweaked, where you step outside the rules a little bit. Rather than trying to win the court case under the normal strategy that they had constructed early in this part of the story, he puts his client on the stand with her ID and realizes that she signed a prenuptial agreement before she was 18. And so he tweaks the rules. He works within the set of the law, as it is in this little story, and he convinces her to explain that she was underage when she signed the prenuptial agreement, which invalidates the prenuptial agreement and gets his client what he was trying to get her all along, which was like a huge divorce settlement. So he works the system from a different angle. And this is something you see a lot in the third act, where the protagonists come up to the third act, they hit an obstacle where their original plan for defeating the villain or for overcoming the main conflict doesn't work. They fail, and then they have to go at it from a slightly different angle and figure out a new solution. And that's what it is. That slightly different angle is kind of stepping outside the rules. If you imagine you're playing chess and you're going all the way through chess, and you realize that you can just take a piece off the board at the end, and your piece just shifts off the board for you to win. They did this a lot in Star Trek, by the way, too. I love classic Star Trek shows because this is what they figure out at the end of every episode. They step outside the boundaries of the rules, just a little bit to solve the problem, and it's always a creative solution. And it's never one, with good execution, it never feels like it's out of place. You always feel like, oh, I should have thought of that interesting outside of the box solution, not like, well, they can't do that. If your reader or your viewer is saying they can't do that, then you got a problem. So Liar Liar is good. Now, of course, there's some great plot, consequences. He feels really bad actually for representing his client, even though he did it honestly. He doesn't like his client. She turns out to be a bad person, and so he has some distress over that. Now let's look at another courtroom drama. This time, A Time to Kill by John Grisham. Now you can watch the movie with Matthew McConaughey and Samuel L. Jackson. It's a good movie. Or you can read the book by John Grisham. It's a good book. The point I'm going to make here is going to be the same regardless of what medium you happen to experience this story in. So, essence of the story is Samuel L. Jackson's character. He murders two perpetrators who have committed a violent act against his daughter, let's say. And he's put on trial for their murder. And the original defense strategies, we're going to try to get him to be insane. And so we're going to have a psychiatrist testify that he's insane. We're going to do these things to try to get him off, of this. There's lots of other drama surrounding, but that's like the main plot. That's the A story. And of course, all of Matthew McConaughey's, or all of the lawyers' attempts to solve the problem end up failing. He puts a psychiatrist on the stand. That psychiatrist ends up basically being exposed as a statutory rapist. All of these bad things end up happening. Samuel L. Jackson gets on the stand and shows no remorse. I'm thinking of the movie right now as I'm saying this. I've read the book, by the way, too, but just the movie's what's coming to mind. So he says, like, yes, I'm glad I killed them, and I hope they burn in hell, right? So he's undoing all of this strategy to try to paint him as somebody who suffered a psychic break because of the violence committed against his daughter. And so the solution is he goes into the final arguments, where you can just talk to the jury. You can make all your arguments. You don't have to adhere to rules of procedure for evidence. You can't introduce new evidence or anything like that, but you don't have to do the normal line of questioning and cross-examination and all those sorts of things that happen with the regular course of a trial. You get to just present your arguments to the jury. And so what he does is, rather than trying to convince them that this guy's insane, he just recounts this act of violence against this guy's daughter in great detail. He appeals directly to their emotions. He appeals directly to their empathy, to their sense of humanity, to understanding how this his client would actually feel. And he says at the end, like, imagine she's white, because his client is black. And they end up acquitting him. So he comes at the solution, having all of his strategies fall apart. He comes at the solution a slightly different angle. I'm just going to appeal directly to their emotion. I'm not even going to try to construct a defense within the framework of the law. I'm just going to ask the jury to acquit, because they understand how bad this was, that they understand this kind of trauma and what it would drive him to do. And it works, right? It's a really, really good example of just one little tweak, and he's able to, within the rule set. It's not like we broke the rules or anything. It's just that we just looked at the angle from a little bit different set of limitations, and we were able to come up with a solution for the plot. And you can just see this over and over again in lots of different mediums, lots of different stories, is that in that transition to the third act, we tweak the rules a little bit. We bend them. We step outside the chessboard, if you will, in order to come up with the solution. And readers tend to really like this. So that's about all I have to say about that. You guys know I'm an author. Latest book is Eyes in the Walls. This is a horror read. Pretty quick to read through. It's a pretty interesting book. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you'll give it a shot. It's 99 cents on the Kindle platform. And if you're watching this in December, this is the only month you can get this bad boy, the Fantasy Christmas Spectacular 2019, which has 10 of my books in it. This thing is a behemoth. It is quite large, as you can see. So you can grab that. It's $20.19 for the epic paperback, or you can get the ebook for $9.99. It has 10 of my books in it. Latest fantasy book, since I was talking about Magic Systems, City of Silver. Sequel hopefully coming soon. So stay tuned, and I'll see you guys next time. Let me know what you think about it. Give me some examples down below. There's so many more that I could think of. It would just make an epically long video, but those are a couple of good examples that I like to refer to. So thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time.